Good morning, everyone, as you're all coming in to the room. It's wonderful that we've got so many people that have signed up for today's webinar in our professional development webinar series. I'm Ash Colhoun. I work for the Centre for Excellence in Rural Sexual Health. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are on, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. For myself, that's the Dja Dja Wurrung people. Wherever we are in Australia, though, we are zooming in from First Nations people's land, and sovereignty was never ceded. We've had lots of people sign up for this webinar today because we've got a great speaker, Katrina Marson, who is an expert on the protective power of sex ed. She's got a background in criminal law and is currently doing her PhD on relationships and sexuality education. Because there are so many of you here, I will just ask that you keep yourself on mute, but you are welcome to ask questions in the chat. And Katrina will ask those throughout and then at the end as well. We are recording this session, so just so you're aware, and we'll be able to share this after those who couldn't come along today. So thank you so much. Katrina, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm zooming in from Ngunnawal country, and I too pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. I'm going to share my screen because I'm going to move through a PowerPoint, and I think that means I won't be able to see if questions come through on the chat. So Ashley, can I ask you to just verbally interrupt me and ask them if and when you think
Absolutely.
appropriate? Thank you. Now, hopefully that's showing the right PowerPoint, because before when we tested it, it was literally Katrina Marson's personal cash flow PowerPoint. So hopefully it's not that one. I'm just trying to bear with me while there we go. Okay. Now I can see that there are some of you in the room who I know and who've probably seen this presentation before, but hopefully there's always something new that comes out of it, particularly when there's discussion with the people that I'm presenting to. So I'm looking forward to talking about this subject matter with all of you. I understand that a lot of you work in the area of sexual health in the rural space. What I talk about with my research, which I was conducted predominantly overseas, although the experiences I've had since returning to Australia are still relevant and I have sort of incorporated into what I discuss. But what I researched overseas, in my view, has quite broad application and sort of universal application. The issues that people face when it comes to the implementation of relationships and sexuality education are common issues, shared issues. But if there are specific questions related to the rural sector, if you like, I would like you to feel free to ask those questions in the chat. And as I've said, Ashley will ask them of me if I don't see them pop up because of the screen sharing. All right, so to start with, I might just talk you through a little bit about me and my background in this space. This is a book that I've written that was published in 2022 that really is the sort of complete picture of my my work, both as a criminal lawyer and in my research as it comes to relationships and sexuality education. So I have spent the better part of my career in the area of criminal law, in particular in sexual offences and family violence, intimate partner violence. Before I went into the criminal law, I did my honours thesis on the ability of relationships and sexuality education to prevent sexual violence versus the criminal justice system. And even though the research was fairly clear that prevention is better than the response of the criminal justice system, I graduated and basically went straight into the criminal justice system anyway. But my decade in the criminal law only served to reinforce for me that we're not doing enough when it comes to safeguarding young people's well-being, when it comes to meeting their right to access education that gives them the knowledge, skills, and information they need to navigate this part of their lives. So that's a little bit about my background, how I arrived at this topic. I will use the acronym RSE. Sometimes I say comprehensive sex education. Sometimes I'll just say sex ed. But what I'm talking about is a comprehensive relationships and sexuality education, the kind that is envisaged by UNESCO and other international authorities. So not just respectful relationships education, not just consent education, but that really holistic, comprehensive approach that the evidence shows is what is effective. So I'll use those terms interchangeably, but I'm generally talking about that. There are probably a lot of you who recognize this book. This was my sex education in grade 4 that I remember. I remember our classroom teacher reading it to us. It was all very awkward and giggly. And the next sex ed I remember happening was in like year 9 when we got condoms on bananas. I remember my friends and I were very fascinated by this book. It was before the age of the internet being in our pockets. So there was sort of one copy in the school library in our primary school, and we would go there quite regularly to go to the aisle that this book was in to read it in sort of giggling secrecy. We knew that it was sort of something a bit naughty, a bit clandestine, but we were just genuinely hungry for information. So I think we thought that the more we read it, the more we might discover. So unfortunately, young people's sex ed in Australia cannot be guaranteed to be much better than this. Certainly there are young Australians getting far better sex education than this, but there are too many who are not, and some who are not getting any at all. And so the problem of sex education in Australia, I often say, is the inconsistency is one of the problems. It certainly can't be said that we can guarantee all young Australians access to comprehensive RSE. I'm assuming that a lot of you, given the work you do, recognise and understand the importance of sex education, but just briefly, these are on the slide, as you can see, some of the known benefits of comprehensive RSE. We know that it is likely to delay first sexual experiences and to reduce negative sexual experiences. We know that it improves social and emotional learning, decreases intimate partner violence, child abuse, and one of my favorite ones is the relationship that it has with improved academic results and attendance. And I say that's one of my favorite ones because of the sort of lack of importance that sex education has in the Australian educational culture, I suppose. It's often a tick the box subject. It's often either it's seen as something problematic, or just people are apathetic towards it. It's not as important as things like academic performance, sporting performance in the Australian culture. So I really like that we know that comprehensive RSE does also improve those things for those who think those things are the most important of all. And again, and this is an extract from the UNESCO International Technical Guidance, which is a really great comprehensive starting point about what CSE should look like, why it's important, and issues and aspects of implementation as well. So what I did in 2018, I was granted a Churchill Fellowship, which is a research grant to go overseas and learn about something that they're doing better overseas that we could do better here in Australia. So it can be anything. It doesn't have to be about sex education. It doesn't have to be anything academic or social justice-y. There are people who've gone on fellowships to look at particular types of rose breeds and growing them. Like it's any subject matter. If you can convince them it's important, they will give you a grant. And I wanted to look at the implementation of RSE in other countries, because whilst there's a lot of research that comes out of Australia about the benefits of RSE, we've always stalled at the point of implementation. Like I said before, the problem of RSE in Australia is very much one of inconsistency. We cannot say that every kid in every classroom is going to get sex ed, even if we have great policy documents, great curricula, great private resources and programs out there. Whether kids will actually get that is just not guaranteed at all. And that's what I wanted to look at, places where they were better able to guarantee young people access to this kind of education. So I went on that fellowship in 2019, and then when I came back, I wrote a report called Ignorance is Not Innocence, which was the slide at the start. And I talk about that in a lot more detail in my book as well. So hopefully I've sort of discussed enough about the case for comprehensive relationships and sexuality education. And as I say, I assume there's a level of existing understanding of that. This is a quote from someone I spoke to in Canada, which really sums it up for me. He was the executive director of the Sex Information and Education Council of Canada. And he said that access to information that can be used to make autonomous decisions is a human right. And certainly it is my view and the view of minds much more intelligent than mine that sex education is in fact a human right and is certainly a human rights issue. So let's look briefly at what I discovered overseas were sort of best practice design features, or what we might call minimum standards, because we can't have a one-size-fits-all approach to sex ed. It will be determined by the community that you're in, the school that you're in, the class that you're in, the individual students that you have. But there are certain, what I would like to call minimum standards of what we should aim for. Multiple sites of intervention. I talk a lot about RSE in schools, and I will come back to why the school is such an important central site of intervention, but it can't be the only site. We need to be trying to capture young people and adults in as many places and ways as possible. Holistic, age-appropriate, repeated and consistent. What we often see, and I've talked a little bit already about why it needs to be holistic rather than just about consent or respectful relationships. And something I often talk about is the need to go beyond just violence prevention, just as we have probably long recognized the need to go beyond just STI prevention, pregnancy prevention. So too, we can't just focus on how you avoid violence. It needs to be much more holistic than that. Age appropriate is something that can be of concern to those who might be troubled that sex ed is going to corrupt young people's innocence or cause them to engage in sexual behaviour earlier than they might otherwise do. And so those of us who advocate for sex education do tend to discuss how and why, or how it's age appropriate and what that might look like. And I can talk a little bit about that in a moment. Repeated and consistent is important because what we often see with sex education is that again, because of perhaps the concerns about what sex education does to young people, or the apathy about it, the lack of prioritization that it's given, or because of curriculum constraints and time constraints that we know schools in particular are under, we see sex ed that is delivered in sort of a 1 hour session per term or a couple of classes in PE per term that might be grouped in with things like drugs and alcohol, and there might be a heavier emphasis on the latter rather than the sex education aspect of it. So we don't see that repetition and the consistency that we know is what makes good sex education effective. It does also need to start young. It's no use introducing these topics in high school, certainly not late high school, certainly not by the time that young people are getting to university, if that's what they're doing with their lives. I always say it's never too late when it comes to sex education, but it can be too late for it to do its best work. And we know that it needs to start young. So what starting young and what age appropriate sex education might look like is something like this, for example, which is what I saw in a sex ed class in England, where these were about, I'd say, grade 3 students and maybe younger, but they were asked to pair up and they were given these scenarios, as you can see, completely non-sexual scenarios. Your friend wants to hold your hand, but you don't want to. You ask your friend something and she nods, but you aren't so sure that she really wants to. Your sister asks you to give her a back rub. And they were asked to imagine how they might have a conversation around that if they didn't want to do those things, or they suspected the other person wasn't particularly enthusiastic. And what I love about this pair is you can see that they haven't just imagined what they would say, they imagine what the response might be as well. And so these are the sorts of activities you can do with young people around self-protection, bodily autonomy, but also communication when it comes to navigating uncomfortable conversations or different interests between 2 or more people. These are the kinds of ways that you can do it in a way that is age appropriate. So for those who might be concerned that we're teaching young people how to have sex, how to masturbate, which is a common sort of myth about what comprehensive sex education does at a young age. This instead is really what we're talking about when we say age-appropriate RSE from a young age. Again, these are even younger, these students. They're being shown cartoon pictures of different scenarios, and they were asked to indicate whether they thought this was an okay or a not okay scenario. And this one, they're shown a picture of what they're told are a boyfriend and girlfriend who are about 15, and he's giving her a kiss on the cheek and she's smiling and saying thank you. Now, obviously, it's a simplistic depiction of something, but they have compared it to the picture prior, which was of a young girl being given a kiss by an uncle, and she's sort of shrinking away and she doesn't look happy, and the kids would give the thumbs down for whether they thought that was an okay situation or not. So again, this is how we teach about comfort, communication, bodily autonomy to those of a younger age. Other things we want to see in relationships and sexuality education include normalizing a positive approach to sexuality. So trying as much as we can to reduce the shame and taboo around sex and sexuality, which is very easy to do, particularly when we're talking to young people, because we don't want to be seen, or we might be fearful of being seen, of encouraging them to engage in sexual behavior. So we might inadvertently resort to abstinence type messaging. And it's really important that we try and steer clear of shame. And I say that with the caveat that that can be very difficult when we have, all of us, grown up in a world that does shame sexuality. And so a lot of us are wearing that shame and having to work through it ourselves. So I only say, as best as we can, trying to reduce some of that shame and be aware of it within ourselves. I often talk about the fact that I do this for a living, and there are still times where I'll get up on a stage talking to students and I'll get to words like penis, vagina, orgasm, and I'll start blushing because I'm a blush when I am embarrassed. It's my tell. And that will still sometimes happen to me because it's so deep-seated. So as much as we can, trying to reduce the shame without being too hard on ourselves if it's not always possible. Modification for particular groups, it's really important that we make sex education relevant and accessible to those we are delivering it to. And so that will look different for different cultural groups, for disabled students, for example. So it's really important that we don't just leave people out, but rather that we endeavour to make it as accessible and relevant to the community that we are educating for. Of course, diversity and inclusivity. So that means the inclusion of queer sexuality in particular, and even in the images that we use, if we're talking about cartoons like what we saw on the previous slide, we want to have a mixture of different bodies, of different sexualities, those sorts of things, so that we're not just reinforcing heteronormative, white, able-bodied sort of normativity. It's really important that we do evaluate the work that we are doing with sex education where we can, and ensuring that we have protections in place, because, as I'm sure most of you would be aware, it's fertile ground for getting disclosures of sexual abuse. So we need to make sure we have protections around that in place as well. This is an example of normalizing a positive approach to sexuality and curiosity around this subject matter that I saw again in England. So I went to a number of different countries. I went to England, Ireland, the Netherlands, Canada, Germany, and the US, but that was just for a conference at the end. But this again was in England. This was in one of the classrooms. So a far cry from the single copy of Where Did I Come From in the school library that my friends and I would secretly go and read. This is a bookshelf in the classroom, and you can see it's the top shelf of the bookshelf is the RSE shelf, and you can see there are a number of different books to choose from and a question box. And the teacher told me that it's really common for kids to take books from this shelf in silent reading time, and no one made fun of them for it. So it didn't have that air of kind of clandestine that I had when I was growing up with that one copy of Where Did I Come From? So this, as I say, this is an example of normalizing a positive approach to this subject matter, making it normal to be curious about it, to talk about it amongst your peers. So having talked a bit about why it's important, what it should look like, I'm going to move now to, I suppose, the crux of my research, which is the implementation question. How do you actually, if we know why and we know what, how do we actually make sure that young people are getting access to this education that they are entitled to? And the answer is not a simple one. These are the 6 factors that I observed in all the countries I went to overseas that seem to be consistent between those countries. They manifested in slightly different ways in each country, but they were all there on each occasion. And I see these as the implementation success factors necessary for the effective implementation of CSE, comprehensive sex education. We'll go through them one by one. Advocacy is the first one. What I observed overseas was that the period where implementation of relationships and sexuality education had really taken off tended to follow some kind of intensified advocacy or lobbyism in that community where it had then effectively been implemented. It often followed something like high-profile sexual violence cases where attitudes were poor attitudes around towards women, for example, or towards sexual violence were revealed in those criminal law cases. And then it sort of created all this question about what are we teaching young people? Something that might sound familiar to us after the past 5 years or so, given certain high-profile sexual violence matters that have been in the media and have predicated these sorts of conversations in the Australian community as well. I think the child abuse scandal in the Catholic Church was a big part of, was a big precursor to sex education being implemented in a lot of these countries as well. Again, that's sort of how are we failing our young people so comprehensively? How can we prevent that? That question seems to lead the way for sex education to answer that question in a lot of these countries. So when I first came back from my fellowship, I said that we were still at this point in Australia, we were still in the advocacy point on that chain of 6 that I talked about. I think we have had that almost perfect storm of social commentary and increased appetite and interest from the community. And those who have probably long been supporters, or at least those who understand the importance of sex education, are more vocal about that now, which is really important when it comes to combating those who are opponents of sex education, which I'll get into more detail later on. So when I first came back, I was saying we're still here. We're not really seeing that kind of community support. But then, so I came back in 2019, then we had Grace Tame being named Australian of the Year. We had the Chanel Contos survey. We had the Christian Porter allegations. We had the Bruce Lerman allegations with the Parliament House, and the way that Parliament House and all of these different institutions responded or failed to respond. So we had this real swell of, we had the March for Justice and those sorts of things. We had this real swell of community attention on the issue, and it meant that there was this increased interest in and an increased recognition of the importance of sex education and pressure on politicians to do something about it, which I'll talk more about when I come to the second success factor. I won't read out all these quotes, but these are quotes of people that I spoke with on my fellowship. And I think this one is particularly poignant. It does tend to take pioneering individuals, probably especially so in the rural sector. There's usually 1 or 2 people who really push this issue, whether in a school or in a community. And certainly we owe our thanks to them. And I'm not saying that what I say next about the need for infrastructural support is not to say that we need to do away with those individuals and those grassroots efforts, not at all. So I'll come back to that in a moment. The second success factor, which I see as particularly important, is the structural support from government and other institutions. This, as I say, this manifested differently in the different countries that I went to. but always there was support from those who hold the policy levers and often the purse strings. As Christiane Erkens in Germany said to me, you always need national government to drive sexuality education. I don't agree that bottom-up strategies will never be successful, but I see it as more of a sort of pincer. If you can bring the grassroots bottom-up strategies and that top-down work from government, you're much more likely to have success at implementation. Germany's like us. They have different states or provinces that and education is the purview of the states rather than a federal responsibility. So that is a relevant quote for us that Christiane has specifically said national government. And I'll talk more about the German approach in due course. As I said, it manifested slightly differently. That big photo is a photo of myself and Kathleen Wynne, who is the former Premier of Ontario in Canada. She platformed for her election on, part of her platform was that she was going to improve sex education because at the time she was campaigning, the sex ed curriculum hadn't been updated since like the 80s or 90s or something. So there was nothing about cyber stuff. There was nothing about queer students or queer sexuality in there. It was incredibly out of date. And she campaigned on a platform that she was going to improve it. She was elected and she did make good on that promise to significant backlash. We're going to come back to that backlash and see what happened when I speak about opposition, as I said I would. But for now, I just want to focus on the use of an election commitment as a way of a sort of structural government support for the issue of sex education, that show of support from a high-profile politician at the top saying this is a platform issue for me. And the efficacy that has in terms of actually creating change. The inset photo is from a forum I went to in the UK shortly after they had legislatively mandated relationships and sexuality education for all students. And so they had this forum where they were talking to people across different sectors about how that implementation might go. Now, there was a lot of hope and promise in the room when I was there. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to have taken off as well as might have been hoped for a variety of reasons. But I still think that a legislative mandate or some kind of mandate from those in power, as I say, those who hold the policy levers, is beneficial and helpful to the implementation of sex education. It just can't be the end of it. It can't be, we'll stick it in a statute and then leave all the schools to work it out. And failed to give them, and I'm not saying this is necessarily the case across the board in the UK, but it can't be that we just leave schools, teachers to their own devices when there's so much more that goes into implementation, as we'll see. One of the third thing that I observed in these countries was the recognition of relationships and sexuality education as a specialist field. This wasn't something that was seen as, someone said to me, it can't just be Bob from geography because he's got a spare period. And I would say it can be Bob from geography if he's been trained to do it and has the relevant aptitude and interest. But the recognition of this as a nuanced subject matter, that if we don't get it right, it's not just that it's ineffective, it can actually be counterproductive, even down to little prepositions that we might use. If we say something like, when a woman has a baby, as opposed to if a person decides they want to have a baby, that makes a big difference in terms of what we're communicating about expectations that young people can have of their lives. It might sound minor, but there are little things like that and little shows of shame or embarrassment that can make a big difference. So I said before that, you know, we can sometimes resort to abstinence messaging, even if we don't mean to, even really well-meaning facilitators and educators can do so. And that can have a negative impact. So we need to recognize that this is a specialist field. It's not just something that we can make up a curriculum. A bunch of adults can get around and make up a curriculum about what we should teach just because we have the expertise of being adults who might have had some sexual experiences in some relationships. This is more nuanced than that. As Brianna Coyle in Ireland said to me, she'd like to see it recognised as a specialised field. examples of that I observed, the big photo is of me and Siobhan O'Higgins, who is an academic in the Department of Psychology at the University of Galway. And she is the architect of some great programs in Ireland called the Active Consent Program, where they ran sessions with university students and school students with scenario-based sessions around relationships, green flags, red flags, consent stuff, ethical behavior. But they actually, these were designed by academics and they were tested for their efficacy before they were rolled out, and even as they were rolled out and after they were rolled out. So you see that kind of degree of quality assurance, that checking that what we're doing is actually working and effective, rather than just sort of making it up as we go. Similarly, the inset photo is of Elspeth Reitzema from the Netherlands. That's the Spring Fever. She designs the Spring Fever program, which is run out of Rutgers, which is kind of like, it's an institute that I would say is a cross between like an academic institution and a think tank. They're funded by the government and they house experts on relationships and sexuality education. Elspeth Reitzema has been doing it for over a decade. And they design programs that have been successful and exported around the world, translated into English for the UK, for example. And again, we see that prioritization of expert design of these programs in the Netherlands. We see it also in Germany as well, which I'll come to in the next success factor. No, not the next one. The one after, I think. So this one is the fourth factor that I observed, which was the equipping of schools, teachers, and educational professionals. This is a really big one for Australia, I think. This is one of the sticking points that we face, particularly after consent's been augmented in the national curriculum, if you like. And all of this talk that we've been having about the need for improved relationships and sexuality education, there are a lot of teachers who feel like it's just another thing added to their plate and they're not getting the requisite support that would go along with it. Remember I said earlier that in England, they created that legislative mandate and the results haven't been as hoped. And part of that is because of a lack of follow through of support for those who are actually delivering sex education. Now, that might not be the classroom teacher. It might be school nurses, for example, or external providers. I think there's a lot of value to be gained from external providers, particularly those who are expert, the right kind of expert. I'm not necessarily a big fan of former police sergeants, for example, coming in and giving lessons on how not to get sexually assaulted or how not to get accused of sexual assault. But there are really good quality private providers of CSE out there. So I'm talking about this across the board. It's not just the classroom teacher, it's also maybe the school and school leadership and school policy who need to be adequately equipped, trained and resourced to ensure the implementation of relationships and sexuality education. This is hard when we've all grown up with generally poor sex education ourselves. It's not hugely prioritized, if at all, in the pre-service qualifications that teachers undertake. So there is a real gap here. And we hear that from teachers all the time. Most of the time, teachers understand the importance of this. They want to give it to their students and they are stuck with how to fit it into their curriculum. They don't necessarily have the confidence that they know they need or the skills. And so that's something that's really important for government in particular to assist with in ensuring that we get this aspect covered off. I said I'd talk about why the school is the sort of important central site of intervention, not the only one. As Christiane Erkin said, it's how you reach all young people. Not all, but most. I also say that it's important because it's one way that you can try and achieve that quality assurance that I talked about with the previous factor, the success factor, that need to make sure that the type of education that young people are getting in this space is of the quality that we know won't have that counterproductive effect that we don't want to see. If we can incorporate sort of pre-service training, for example, those minimum standards that I talked about earlier, into the existing educational framework that we have in this country, so much the better. And yes, we can access most young people. In terms of barriers, these are some of the ones that we see reported consistently from teachers and schools. So this is from the Sexuality Education in Australian Secondary Schools report from some years ago, but anecdotally, these concerns are the same. It doesn't get the same level of support from education authorities as other areas. It's poorly resourced. Teachers and schools remain unsupported and untrained. Historically, sex ed policy decisions have been that sort of deficit approach that I talked about, where we don't get an STI, don't get pregnant, don't. Now it's very much don't sexually assault someone. Curriculum time constraints, lack of confidence, and adverse community reactions, which again, I'll come back to. Opposition I come to right at the end, but everything sort of feeds into the opposition to sex ed. So these are consistent barriers, and these are ones that we need to actively try and overcome and be prepared for and mitigate when it comes to the implementation of sex education. And there are good professional development programs out there, including in Victoria. I know that Talking the Talk, for example, is one great resource for professional development for teachers, and there are certainly others across the country. But that needs to be supported by school leadership as well. It's no good for one individual classroom teacher who feels really passionate about this to have to bear the brunt of trying to implement sex education in their class, only to not be supported by school leadership when one parent complains about it. And we see that happening a lot. They need to be backed in by school leadership, who in turn need to be backed in by the education department or the school board, and the education department, who in turn need to be backed in by the relevant minister. It's as simple as that. Unfortunately, the opposition to sex ed means that any chinks in that armor or that chain are a weakness for the implementation of sex education. This is a teacher that I met again in England who was giving a consent class as part of a comprehensive sex education class for her primary school group. Now, this wasn't just a consent education course. It's just that I happened to be there on consent day. And it was clear that the students had previous lessons, because the way the language they had, the literacy they had around this, and the sort of recap questions they were answering made it very clear that they had numerous classes on this subject matter. This teacher had been trained by the local educational health department, by the local council, who had designed the program that they were rolling out. They designed the program and then they helped train the teachers to deliver it. So this teacher was supported by her school leadership. I spoke to the principal as well, who spoke about how important she thought this education was, and the support they had from the parent community as well. So that's an example where you see local government supporting and resourcing the schools to actually deliver this in a comprehensive and effective way. Before I move on to the next one, I do want to touch on the German approach, which is one of my preferred sort of approaches that I observed. They, in their federal health department, they have a branch dedicated to sex education. It's separate from their sexual violence prevention branch. The two branches work closely together, but they very much see them as separate. Because they see sexuality education as being the baseline that all young people are entitled to, regardless of whether or not they are potential victims or potential perpetrators. The way I like to summarize it is, if we eradicated sexual violence entirely, if we had a sexual violence-free world, young people would still be entitled to sex education. It is so much more than sexual violence prevention. So in Germany, they have those two branches. They work together, but they are separate. The sex education branch designs sexuality education for the states. So remember I said that education is the purview of the states in Germany, as it is for us here, but their federal department designs sex education programs that they then help the state education departments to roll out at a state level. And that includes resources, curricula, but also training for teachers and support for teachers, and community-based communications and I guess messaging to enhance support at a community level as well. So again, we see that government support of equipping schools to actually do the work, not just issuing the mandate and leaving them to their own devices. The fifth one, which I'm sure you know is very important, is the engaging of parents, caregivers, and I would add community in that. This is something that most sex education providers in Australia that I know of do this work very effectively, private providers certainly, and schools attempt to do it with mixed results. It's really important to engage the parent community because it's not enough for a young person to get a great sex ed lesson in the classroom. They could have the best sex ed provider, the most confident teacher, the best activities, the best curriculum, the best class. And if they go home and their parents say, I don't know why you're learning about that, that's not important. Even something as sort of relatively neutral as that can have a diluting effect on the impact of that sex ed lesson. So it's really important that we engage parents, and also because a lot of young people will go home with questions, and a lot of parents want help in answering those questions and knowing how they can continue these conversations around the dining table that might have been provoked by a lesson in class, or even not so. Parents, we know, are the first educators of young people, and a lot of them are crying out for help with how to navigate this particular issue and this topic. The other reason that it's important to engage parents and caregivers is because that is where a common source of opposition can come from. Opposition from parents is perceived from the parent community, I would say. The perception is greater than the reality. And we know that now because of recent research I was involved in with Curtin University, where we surveyed 2,500 Australian parents about their attitudes to RSE being delivered in schools. Here's what we found. Nearly 90% of Australian parents support RSE in schools. And we asked them details about what kinds of subject matter. And the support for some of the things you might think were a bit more controversial was also higher than we even expected. You don't get numbers like 90% in research in terms of the agreement for it being provided in schools. That's a huge majority. Those that we hear from opposing sex education, we know are a small minority, but they are very loud and they can be very, very effective. What we sought to achieve with this research was to bring actual hard evidence of the majority who want better sex ed for their kids in schools. You can see there that they support topics like masturbation, gender identity, and sexual pleasure being taught in schools. That may surprise some of you. It surprised us. And this crossed political and religious lines as well. So we talked to parents who had kids in each sector. And when we talked to parents, for example, who had kids in Catholic schools, who were religious themselves and their Catholicism was an important part of their life, we still saw strong support for sex education in schools. So I want people to feel heartened by this research, empowered by it, and to use it when we face things like opposition from what is a minority of parents. If we can mobilize the support of those in the parent community who do understand and want better sex education for their schools, for their kids in schools, then we should certainly do so. I can just see there's been a question. Can you access the report on the Curtin research? Yes, it is available. The journal article is available. What I'll do when I get a second is I can actually drop a link to an article I wrote in The Age about it, which links to the research, but also summarizes it. So I'll do that if I don't forget. If I do forget, I can certainly get Ashley to provide it later. So it's really important that we do engage parents, and what we saw, if I can keep moving through my slides. Yeah. So sometimes people will react to advocacy around sex education in schools, thinking that those who advocate for it are suggesting it is the sole purview of the school and that it is an attempt to cut the home out of it. I would always advocate that it be a partnership. I don't know any sex education researcher or sex educator or advocate who would say otherwise. As you can see there, Jan in Lincolnshire said that schools need to get a lot better at talking to their parents and involving them. This is an example of that. This is a private provider who, for every session they deliver to young people, they will first deliver a session to the parents of that class. Now, this particular parent session I went to, no parents showed up. No parent showed up because this provider had been in that school for so many years that there was no longer any concerns, any questions that were had by any parents. So the provider ran through it for me and for the teachers that were there, but then we packed up and went home because there were no parents. I did accompany her to another school where they were new to the school, and there were a lot of parents, and there were a lot of angry parents or concerned parents, but there was a degree of hostility in the room. This is maybe something that some of you are familiar with. So it's really important that we meet those concerns and that we give parents an opportunity to discuss them, in large part because if we don't, I mean, no one likes being told what to do. No one likes having their choices taken away from them, particularly when it comes to their child's education. So telling parents what to do without giving them the opportunity to raise questions and concerns leaves room for those fears to grow into complete derailment of the whole sex education program for all the other students as well. And I've personally experienced that with schools where some parents have been really concerned about it. And it means that instead of just taking their kids out of the class, I've been uninvited from going to the school, and the whole cohort misses out, even though there were other parents who had, off their own bat, gone up to the teacher who'd arranged it and thanked them for the fact that it was happening because they were really glad that someone was coming to talk to their kids about that. What about those parents is what I want to ask. Why are those parents and their needs and their desires for their kids' education so readily discarded in favor of those who are opposing it, who could equally just take their kids out of the class? So it's really important that we build that relationship and we do that work before we introduce sex education. That said, there also needs to be a degree of courage of our convictions and standing on the evidence that this is a matter of well-being for young people, that they're entitled to this information and education, and that the school will, and again, this goes back to that sort of structural support, the school will press on. And if you don't want your child to have it, then you can certainly feel free to withdraw them from the class, for example. That's one way of dealing with it. We need to be sure that we're evaluating the education we offer young people so that we make sure it's working and we can hold ourselves accountable. The good thing about getting evidence that a program is working is that it's more justification for continuing with that program and ensuring that longevity. I love this quote that describes that it is hard to measure the absence of something if we're talking about prevention. But what we know is the international research is really clear about the benefits that comprehensive sex education provides, and the clear inference from that is that not providing it is actually harming young people's well-being and an abrogation of their rights. So there are ways of measuring the success of particular courses and educational programs. We can look at literacy, for example, comfort levels, retention of certain messages, self-reported feeling of confidence around using particular skills or information that's been taught. So there are ways of doing it, notwithstanding the difficulty that we might face in trying to prove the prevention of sexual violence, for example. So now let me talk about risks to implementation, which I'll do briefly so that there's time for questions. Obviously, resourcing funding is a big risk. The ability to open up time in the curriculum is a risk to implementation. These are all things that fetter the successful implementation of sex ed. The one I want to focus on is opposition to sex ed. I'm not going to try and pronounce this word. My German I don't have any German. I'll butcher it if I try. But what it means is early sexualization. And it's a word that conservative political parties in Germany deployed deliberately in opposition to those parties who were those politicians and policymakers and local governments that were endeavouring to improve relationships and sexuality education for young people. The suggestion was that kind of education would sexualize young people. This is the most common drum that is beat by opponents to sex education. This is notwithstanding the evidence that we know the opposite happens. The earlier and the more you talk to young people about sex in an age-appropriate way, the later they're likely to have their first sexual experiences and the less likely they are to have negative sexual experiences. That's what the evidence is. Yet this myth is such a common one and it's very popular and it's very effective. So I often say that even if we have all 6 of those implementation success factors in place, if we're not prepared for this, the whole thing will come crumbling down. And we saw an example of that last year with Welcome to Sex. I'm sure many of you saw the community response to that book by Dr. Melissa Kang and Yumi Steins, which is a great book about sex and sexuality for young people. It is age appropriate. It's designed for young people of a certain age, or for parents to take their young people through. Obviously, it's a choice for people to buy that book or not. Yet there was such a strong community reaction from a particular area of the community and a smallish minority who suggested that the book was corrupting young people. It was effectively pornographic, inappropriate in the way that it was talking about different types of sexual activity. And it got so bad that Big W staff were being abused for the book being stocked on Big W shelves, such that the company decided to remove it from their shelves. They still sold it online, but they took it off the shelves. That is how effective opposition can be. They're organized and they mobilize. So that is something that we always need to be aware of. And this is where I want to come back to Kathleen Wynne, the Premier of Ontario. I said she campaigned on a platform of improving sex ed. She made good on that election promise, and then she received such a furor of backlash to that. She was later ousted by in the next election, she was ousted by the opposing party. Now, I don't know that it was just because of that, but certainly that was a big part of her political history, I would say. There were massive protests about it, again, based on misinformation about what the curriculum was actually, what it included. So again, we see that it's teaching young people to masturbate, it's teaching them how to have anal sex. These are the common sorts of myths that will come out, and fear-mongering that will occur, even though it didn't do that. And anyone who had a look at the curriculum would see that it didn't do that. But I think it was Churchill who said that a lie gets halfway around the world before the truth has time to get its pants on. It can be really effective, and it can be hard to respond to once it happens. Kathleen Wynne said to me that if she had her time over again, she would have been more prepared for that. There would have been more of a public messaging work by her team, a bit more preemptive, I suppose, PR work, basically, that worked to message to the community about why this is so important and nothing to be afraid of, and why not doing it is actually really harmful for young people. So I think it's something we always need to bear in mind. But what I like to say is that even in countries where they have really successful implementation, they still face this. So it's nothing to run away from. It's something that we actually need to be prepared to meet. And it is going to take a bit of courage of standing on our convictions and trying to do what we can to get the main gatekeepers on board, and by which I mean teachers, school leadership, politicians, council, those sorts of things, and trying to mobilize the supportive parent base that we know exists. So that's all I wanted to say about the implementation of sex education and how I see it as applying to Australia. As I say, I think there are really universal themes to it that run across whatever sector or area we're talking about, rural, regional, urban. But if there are specific questions pertaining to the rural sector, please do send them my way. I can see there are a few in the chat, so I'll just have a look. Well, thank you, Vanessa, for linking to that research, that Curtin University research. And Ashley for linking the SMH article. Jess, you've said fueled by the mainstream media. I assume you're talking about opposition to sex ed. If you want to pipe up, feel free.
Yeah, when you were talking about Welcome to Sex,
yep.
If the media didn't give that small minority so much airtime, and they were just complaining about it on their own Instagrams, it would not have been a big deal. Big W wouldn't have cared.
Yeah,
and clickbait.
And that's the hard thing, is that it does sell. This kind of controversy and furor does sell. So media do tend to run it. And I saw that when I was looking into the response that Kathleen Wynne got. It's very easy to find articles from that time describing the protests that took place after after the sex ed had been updated, the curriculum had been updated, because yeah, it does make for good clickbait, unfortunately. And so, yeah, I don't know, I don't have the whole answer, but certainly I know that the courage of our convictions and relying on the evidence is going to be a big part of responding to that sort of opposition. Yeah. Are there any other questions? Tracy.
Yep, just found my microphone. Hi. For anyone who I haven't met, I'm the CEO of the Family Planning Alliance in Australia. So we already have an RSE alliance of senior educators in each state. And there's various levels of programs going on. So I just wanted to say how much we support what's been said today, because this is our dream. And to that effect, we did put a how to roll out, how to scale up pre-budget submission in this year, because we agree that it's a unique time in history, for all the reasons that Katrina set out. And it's that unique time that has meant that we've been confident to put our hands up, describe a successful model, and be very open about how it works and propose a scale up. And at the moment, that's we're opening up to talk about the South Australian model, which is the focus schools model. And so that's been going for 20 years now. And the comments about pushback have been really interesting, because before I was in this job, I was Director of Education there. And I was the person that got the emails that you're a Marxist and you're sexualizing our children all the time and all this kind of thing. And in years gone by, 20 years ago, the CEO ended up having to resign from death threats. So even though it's minor, and now after 20 years, we know exactly where they are, what schools they're influencing geographically, which religious leaders are on what school councils. And we're not alone, because the Department of Education have problems with those schools too, but they're minor. And we sit and we wait until that person retires or moves on, and we step in again. And we try and create that critical mass. And so now 80% of government secondary schools have the SHINE curriculum going on. So, and year by year, we're measuring increases in the number of lessons, and student satisfaction. So it is something that everyone is fearful of, and it is real, because we work in reproductive rights. You know, we're part of the Planned Parenthood Federation, and part of that deal is that I get guaranteed that the Federation globally will lift me out if needed, sort of thing. But mostly it's not needed, but you do need to get together and band together, and we'd be more than happy to join any national group that wants to get together to start that intensive advocating.
Yeah, well, on that point, I would point to something like Blue Med, which is over west, who are sort of a group of advocacy. They do advocacy work, they post research, sort of sex educators and sex researchers pulling together in to that end. And you're right that this isn't a laughing matter. I mean, death threats are common in this issue globally. I don't mean they come commonly, but they are consistent across.
I've got to.
Sorry. So that is something that we see across the world. You know, there was a group that I observed in my research overseas, and they were saying that one of their educators the week before had been sort of surrounded by parents in the car park who weren't directly physically threatening them, but certainly it felt menacing, and that's common. So it's not a joke when we talk about opposition to sex ed. People get really riled up about this, and it is really important that we support each other. And I know that there have been some of us who have been on the receiving end of some of that public concern and fears and have reached out to each other just for words of support. And I personally have found that really encouraging. So yeah, it's an ongoing issue. Jess, you have a question. Just need to unmute.
Sorry. Regarding cultural sensitivity, we recently had a sexual wellness planning day in Shepparton, and we all agreed that obviously education is key to to getting the word out there and to getting everyone educated at the same level. But we have a very multicultural community and quite a conservative community. And the main issue we had was obviously the resistance from parents. But how have you ever seen it done well where you've worked or other people have worked with those cultures and the people within those cultures and been able to get some sort of education to those children as well?
Yeah. Where I have seen it work well has always included things like co-design with community members, and also finding those in the community who support sex education, and they are there, and effectively mobilizing that support basically, and that co-design process. And also I think really prioritizing the voices of young people and what they want to know and what they would appreciate learning about, and again trying to mobilize that, because we hear from young people all the time that they want better relationships and sexuality education. Sadly, we hear it a lot once they've got to university, and they lament that they didn't have enough of it at school, which is concerning and something we should be worried about. But yeah, so actually tapping into the young people themselves, finding those in the community who are supportive, and then that process of co-design, yeah, is where I've seen it work effectively. Siobhan.
Hi, Katrina. That was an absolutely fabulous discussion. And as a parent, I've been in the primary school where the principal has stopped the sex ed because 3 parents raised up their hand. And so, but aside from that, I just wanted we educate, so I work for SERSH as well. We educate medical students, and just leading on from that statement around once students get to university, that they haven't, we all turn up with the same sort of crap sex education that we've had in the high school. So we're dealing with a whole lot of students who are going to become doctors, and this is not just for doctors, it's all health practitioners. How is it best to go around improving their sex education so that they can actually be really good clinicians in the area, knowing that, particularly general practice and, O&G have a predominance of issues surrounding sex?
Yeah, and I think this is why it's really important that we talk about sites of intervention beyond the school. There are so many different points of contact that we need to reach. And I would love to see RSE being taught at pre-service qualification level for teachers, for example, but maybe we might also consider it for med students, given it's something that they will have to obviously confront in their practice. The ideal, of course, is that if we can achieve better sex education at a generational level, it means that we improve the sort of baseline level of literacy and comfort and knowledge that people are going into whatever their profession is when they do. But we do also need to think about delivering sex education to different professional groups, for example. Like I said, it's never too late when it comes to sex ed. It might be too late for it to do its best work, but it's never too late to actually do it. So it's great to hear that you are doing work with those students. And certainly it'd be great if we could see more of that. Don't know if that quite answers your question. It'd be good if it was actually in the tertiary education that they got.
It's kind of catching up the loop until the bit back here is good, is catching up for the students. But yeah, thank you.
No worries.
Great. Thank you so much, Katrina. We are out of time. I'm just having a look.
Oh, yes, we are. Sorry.
No, that's great. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was fantastic. Someone has asked for the link or further info about Blue Med advocacy. If you had that handy, would you be able to put that into the chat?
Let me type it properly. It's Blue Med. Sorry, I
Blooming.
should have said how it was spelled. BLOOM-ED. If you just search that, you'll find it on Google. I'm just looking at this question from Jeremy.
It's not so much a question, just a statement that over the years, and I've been doing sex ed in schools. I'm a school nurse. I've been doing it for like 15 years. And I often see or go to events of university age kids. It's a constant thing where they'll say the sex ed is crap. I've worked in schools and I know a lot of my workmates, school nurses, and the schools we work in and the people that do it do really good sex ed. But there is this perception that school sex ed is always terrible, and often it's not. Often it's really good. It's like really good. But some kids just aren't ready or just weren't paying attention. As my comment said, I've actually had kids say to me they didn't get certain aspects of the sex ed, and I know very well that they did because I delivered it, and they were there. So
Yeah.
sometimes they're
And that's
just not ready.
Yeah, and that's okay too.
So that idea that all school sex ed is crap, I just don't think it's true. I think we've come
Look,
so
and
far.
I don't think that I said all school sex ed is
No,
crap. Certainly not.
you didn't. But a lot of
I think he's referring to me, and I actually didn't mean it, Jeremy.
There's a lot of the majority of young people say that they didn't get good sex ed, when I think a lot of them actually really did. That's all.
I don't know. I don't know. If we're talking about self-reporting, I don't know what this sort of percentage would be of those who did and are misreporting what they got or didn't. But I think it's okay that there are some kids who we may not have reached in whatever particular lesson they might have had, or lessons plural, and it may be that they get reached later. But hopefully those good sessions that were delivered did reach other students who may just not be the ones who were saying they got crap sex ed. And certainly, I mean, even my own experience, I remember getting Where Did I Come From? I remember getting Condoms on Bananas. I'm sure there was stuff in the middle, and I'm sure there was good stuff as well that didn't sort of linger. But I think it's still, the evidence is still clear that there is a significant inconsistency in what young people are getting in this country when it comes to sex education. And I know from my experience that there are schools who are not doing it at all, or are doing abstinence only education, or are only sort of drip feeding certain bits of information. So there's sort of different areas of improvement across the board. So it must be disheartening to hear from students that they feel they didn't get good sex ed when you know that they were given something that was best practice. But like I said, there will always be those kids, and I think that's okay. And we simply hope that we reached other kids in that class, which I'm sure you did. Yeah.
Great. We will have to end it there. Katrina, thank you again so much for your time. And I hope that everyone has a good day. Again, this was recorded and it will be on the Search website and YouTube in the next couple of weeks. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.